Assalamu alaikum. Welcome to New Wave Global. I'm Rabia Mehmood. New Wave is an independent news site relying on your feedback. Please do subscribe, like, and comment on our discussions. Today, we are joined by Ejaz Haider, a senior writer and editor. He's also a columnist with the Friday Times. Ejaz is also a resident fellow at the Center for Security Strategy and Policy Research at the University of Lahore. Ejaz, welcome to New Wave Global again.
Thank you, Rabia.
So, we want to ask you to explain to us what the United States foreign policy would look like in the Trump administration. You have recently written about this for the Friday Times. I mean, you've been writing for months, but referring to your recent most article. And I noticed that you said that he is not impulsive. He could be brazen, dangerous, and transactional, but not impulsive. We've also seen that he's been very predictable and has done what he promised that he would do. Because of all these executive orders he's passed, his comment on the real estate in Palestine, and speaking of the Sea of Gaza and what more can happen there. So it's been he's actually so far behaved the way we thought he would, although some people call him unpredictable. Can you explain to us a bit more what you meant by the fact that he's not impulsive?
Okay, I'll try my best. Trump is actually quite a remarkable person, and I don't mean that in a positive sense. It's just that you cannot really pigeonhole him into any particular theoretical framework. The theoretical frameworks that we generally use in international relations in terms of how a particular politician or leader, or in this case, United States president, has been approaching issues. For instance, you talk about neoliberal or liberal internationalist framework, which was used by Barack Obama, it was used by Biden. And then of course there's the structural realist framework. How do you look at great power competition? You cannot really pigeonhole Trump into that. Having said that, and that was the point that I was making in the Friday Times article that you referred to. As a matter of fact, I made that point in a much longer piece for Dawn magazine last year in November. A careful reading of some of Trump's statements over 3 decades, actually, they show that he has a coherent and consistent worldview. Now, whether that worldview is good or bad, we are not debating that right now. We can get into that later. But I'm simply talking about the coherence and consistency of that worldview. And to me, that is unlikely to change. It did not change last time he was in Oval Office, and it is unlikely to change this time in his 4-year term. As a matter of fact, this time, he is much more aware of the ins and outs of Beltway than he was when he became president last time, because he was an outsider. And there are three key arguments that he kind of returns to time and again. One is that America is overstretched. The other is that the US allies have taken advantage of the United States. And the third one is that the global economy doesn't serve America well. And if you look at his previous tenure, you will see that his approaches revolved around these three motifs. As a matter of fact, when you asked me that we're going to do this program, I actually pulled out an interview of Trump's from 1990. Let me see if I can pull it up here. Okay. Right. So he was asked, and we're talking about 1990. He was asked that what would a President Trump foreign policy be like? And his response was, and I'm now quoting from what he said, he, as in Trump, would believe very strongly in extreme military strength. He won't trust anyone. He won't trust the Russians. He won't trust our allies. He would have a huge military arsenal, perfect it, understand it. Part of the problem is that we are defending some of the wealthiest countries in the world for nothing. we're being laughed at around the world defending Japan. So you can see very clearly that as far back as 1990, when he wasn't actually pining for or campaigning for becoming the president, he still had a certain worldview. And if you look at his last tenure and what he's been saying on the campaign trail this time, it sails very closely to what he said in 1990, and which I've just quoted to you. So it's interesting that this person has a certain way of saying things, and he comes across as obviously brazen. He comes across as crass. There are Republicans who called him a wrecking ball. The other people who have been talking about the fact that this guy is transactional, which of course he is. But the fact is that he's not inconsistent. And I think before we go into what exactly he's likely to do, we have to remember that inconsistency is not one of his traits.
Okay. Okay. So he's been consistent. No, this is fascinating that you pulled out an interview from 1990, because that's when he wasn't even a celebrity as
Yeah.
such, the way he was. This is before the fame he got as a reality TV star, and
Yeah.
became yeah, and he was introduced to the world on the scale that he was, even to the people in the US. So that's interesting. So how do we one thing, like you also wrote, and also when he was the president last time, the rest of us, people who have ties to the US, imperfect ties, and how it impacts of course what the United States does impacts the world, is that he was taking certain actions inside the country, which of course looked quite brazen, and were there was repression and whatnot, and his treatment of immigrants, the treatment of what was happening to um, people of different faith in the minorities in the country. And yet we also always maintain that the United States relationship to the rest of the world is different. He might be doing things at home which the US has done to the rest of the world in terms of wars and whatnot. He of course also wanted to withdraw from Afghanistan, and he said that he wanted to, it was his instinct to do so in 2017, and he should have trusted his instinct at that time and what. But now he's come to the office and managed to uh, bring about or gotten Israel to say yes to a ceasefire agreement in the Middle East. And we don't know if it will hold or not. He's also said it. How do you see his? Let's start with the Middle East. Um, how do you see his foreign policy in the Middle East? Do you think it's going to be a Trump foreign policy and not like a United States foreign policy, or is he's going to do what he wants to do, or is there going to be sort of he's going to listen to other people and then make a decision based on consensus for that matter?
Okay, so you put a lot on the table. But before I specifically get to the Middle East,
Okay.
I will say that notwithstanding what I earlier said about his worldview being consistent and coherent, and I also qualified it with the caveat that in and of itself does not mean that worldview is good or bad.
Yeah.
That obviously requires a different kind of judgment. But the fact is that there are many other complexities and competing factors that obviously weigh in on how decisions are ultimately made. Remember, Trump is not applying force to an inanimate object, whether domestically or externally. And I'm deliberately using this kind of Clausewitzian term because this whole idea of applying force comes from mechanics. So you have a surface, you have a certain object which has weight and mass, and you applying force to it. Depending on the surface, it will always react in a particular predictive way.
Hmm.
But once you are applying force to an animate object, whether it's an individual, whether it's a collection of people, you cannot, no one can factor in how that animate object is going to react to your application of force. So it is very difficult to figure out, given the complexities and competing factors, of how Trump's approach to states, to their leaders, and to certain situations is actually going to work out.
Hmm.
So that's something that needs to be understood. And I can give you an example. I mean, he starts as a bully. We saw that happen last time when he was in Oval Office.
Hmm.
Uh, it did work with South Korea. It worked with Canada. It worked with Mexico, where he renegotiated NAFTA, renamed NAFTA. He simply renegotiated KORUS, which is a Korean-US trade agreement. But that did not work with Kim Jong-un, for instance.
Hmm.
You know? So similarly, Middle East is a very complex area with a very complex history. And Trump's policy will have some of his own personal approaches, but it has to be broadly seen in terms of what the United States policy towards Israel and Palestine traditionally has been. Now, Joe Biden, presumably a liberal internationalist, presumably someone who believed in rules and regulations, a rules-based order, in human rights, and blah blah blah. We now know that he was completely complicit in what Benjamin Netanyahu and his war cabinet had planned and how they were going to execute those plans in Gaza. He said this in so many words to one of the recent interviews on MSNBC. He said that I told Netanyahu, Bibi, you cannot go carpet bombing Gaza. And according to Biden's statement, Netanyahu said to him, but you carpet bombed Berlin, you dropped a nuclear bomb, you have killed thousands of people. And so, just to cut a story short, Biden said that ultimately he was convinced that Netanyahu had a point, had a legitimate point, if I remember his words correctly. So the United States fully supported Netanyahu's war in Gaza. And I do not see that changing with Trump. What will change is what he did last time. What did he do last time? He pushed for these Abraham Accords, which was essentially getting Arab countries to normalize with Israel.
Yeah.
He shut down the PLO office.
Hmm.
He accepted the quote unquote legitimacy, which obviously is not legitimate, but the legitimacy of Israel's occupation of Golan Heights.
Hmm.
He basically, for decades, the United States had stayed away from this Jerusalem controversy and kept its embassy in Tel Aviv.
Hmm.
It was Trump who said that he's going to move the US embassy to Jerusalem.
True.
And Jerusalem, as you know, is one of the central problems between the Zionists and the Palestinians fighting for their freedom.
True.
And his son-in-law, Jared Kushner, you must have seen the report recently that he has invested money in a company that is into the construction business and illegal settlements in occupied Palestinian territories. And then he has one of the executive orders is that he has removed the sanctions against these illegal settlements.
Settlers. Investment, yeah.
So my point being that we have to see very clearly and understand very clearly that his reading of the Riot Act, if you will, to Netanyahu with reference to the ceasefire deal is not the same thing as his approach to what should ultimately be a peace deal between the
Hmm.
Zionists and the Palestinians. These are two different things altogether. And therefore, I saw some people kind of, well, not deliberately, but in good faith, trying to conflate these two things. But that
Hmm.
conflation is incorrect. And it and but here's the question: why did Trump tell Steve Witkoff, his special envoy for the Middle East, to go and tell Netanyahu that he has to sign on the ceasefire deal? Because
Hmm.
that is what and who Trump is.
Hmm.
Well, if you want me in your corner, you need to know that I am the boss.
Hmm.
And if you accept that I am the boss, then we have a deal and then we can work.
Hmm.
I mean, there are so many examples.
Hmm.
Look at this whole business of Canada. He just wanted to humiliate Justin Trudeau
Hmm.
and the Canadians. And this whole business of Panama Canal and
Hmm.
what he said about 38,000 Americans having lost their lives building that canal is actually, if you go and fact check it, that's not correct.
Hmm.
Much of that labor was from the Caribbeans.
Hmm.
And similarly, this whole business of Greenland, although I will put Greenland into a different category,
Hmm.
because this is not the first time Trump has talked about Greenland. We talked about it last time he was in office. But more than that, this is not the first time that the Americans have wanted to buy Greenland. Immediately after Second World War, the Americans had basically told Denmark that we're going to give you $100 million in gold bars and we would like to purchase Greenland.
Hmm.
But the Danes said, well, thanks, but no thanks. And but the whole idea is, and we can get into that, why this whole business of Arctic is now becoming such a matter of interest for the Americans. The fact is,
Hmm.
since Second World War, as a matter of fact, when the Nazis occupied the Danish mainland, the Americans went and they based themselves in Greenland, and they've
Hmm.
had bases there since that time, and they still have a major base there and multiple listening posts in Greenland. So he is now obviously talking about it once again, and he sprung it because he, again, from a bully pulpit, basically, to put the Danes under pressure. And he also knows that there is now a rising independence movement in Greenland.
In Greenland.
And the Greenlanders have actually come after Trump's statement and said that, we have to be part of this conversation. So the Greenlanders, in a way, have tried to, if not subtract Denmark from this conversation, and said that this conversation should not be between Denmark and the United States. We are also part of this conversation. And Trump clearly is going to, if he moves forward with this and
Hmm.
presses this point, he's going to rely on this Greenland independence movement. So he's not being stupid. He's being very smart and wily about it.
Yeah, and he sees an opportunity as being strategic. Yeah, definitely. The US's interest in the Arctic region and this, I think, merits more in-depth conversation. But I am going to bring this back to the Middle East and then towards South Asia slowly. If you would allow me, you mentioned the normalization with Arab states, and of course you wrote about that Palestinians were excluded from the process previously, of the Abraham Accords, and also in that way are the United States is also responsible for October 7th, in addition to in other ways, lifelong, having, as the academics say, Israel is the colonial outpost of the US in the Middle East. But what about Saudi Arabia and Saudi Arabia's normalization and for the acceptance of Israel, which everyone thought that after October 7th and what Israel did um, in Gaza that's going to impact uh, KSA's acceptance of Israel. Um, and how will that impact? Um, I know you don't like speculating at all and giving just sort of your view, but how will that impact Pakistan's stance on Israel?
Okay, this is actually a question that Raza asked me last time we were speaking.
This is something we're all
Yeah.
curious about. Yeah.
So let me try and answer this at two different levels. One is that Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad, or the Al-Aqsa Martyrs Brigade, which are part of Fatah basically, and some of the other armed resistance groups in Gaza and in the West Bank. These are groups that the Arab states do not like. At least in the case of Hamas, there is also the old Muslim Brotherhood connection. And you know that Egypt persecuted Muslim Brotherhood from Nasser's time, and then during Sadat's time, and then Hosni Mubarak, and once again under Sisi. This is also the approach of Saudi Arabia. This is also the approach of these smaller Gulf states. Qatar is the only exception. Turkey is, of course, Turkey is an exception with reference to Muslim Brotherhood. So that's one thing. They they would be happy. I'm talking about the rulers. If Israel can decimate or degrade the capabilities of these groups. Ditto for Hezbollah, but for a completely different reason. So that's one thing. But then there is the street. There's the popular opinion of Israel as a Zionist, apartheid, settler colonial enterprise. And there is a lot of sympathy for the armed resistance groups and what they are doing, how much they have sacrificed, and the rest of it. That's the case in Jordan, that's the case in Egypt, that's the case in the Gulf states, that's the case in Saudi Arabia. Basically, that's the case across most of the Muslim world or Muslim majority countries, including Pakistan.
Definitely.
So therefore, for these rulers, much as they want to normalize with Israel, especially Saudi Arabia, I mean, the sole business of projecting Saudi Arabia as the beacon of modernity in this part of the world, which is essentially the quote unquote vision projected by Mohammed bin Salman. I mean, you must have seen the videos of when they got this, the football World Cup 2034 or whenever it's going to happen, and these guys were, euphoric. They were like a 5-year-old in a candy store. So ideally,
that and all the fashion shows and concerts happening. We've been following. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Ideally, from their perspective, and when I say this, it really, really pains me, but it's a fact. Ideally, they would want this Palestinian issue to just evaporate. They would want to normalize with Israel. They would not want this street to stand between their aspirations and this, this aspiration to modernize and to normalize with Israel. But the street is there. And therefore, they will make these noises about Israeli atrocities and, Israeli genocidal war in Gaza, and that unless there is a settlement between the Palestinians and the Zionists, they will not normalize. So for Saudi Arabia, it is a problem. At least at this point, it's a problem. Now, I don't know how much of, because Trump is transactional, how much of the quid they are going to accept for the core of normalizing with Israel. That remains to be seen. I am not discounting that. Okay. There is a possibility that that happens. And I don't know at what point. However, as I said, there are many unknowns there. You know, we are not like Allah, who's Al-Alim, who's all-knowing, you know, omniscient. We cannot look into the future. But the fact is that in terms of what these Arab countries really want, they would want actually the Palestinian issue to just go away. But it's not going away. And therefore, unless there is some kind of settlement, it will be very difficult for them to go through with this business of normalization, especially for KSA. Another important issue here is what will happen to the Palestinians in Gaza after the ceasefire deal goes through. As you know, it's a three-phase deal. But in some ways, even more importantly, what is going to happen in the West Bank, especially with these illegal settlements? Last time Trump was there, the United States was actually funding these illegal settlements. And then US ambassador to Israel, Friedman, who's Jewish himself, was constantly photographed with the likes of Ben Gvir and Smotrich and others. And Friedman's daughter, at that time, made aliyah to the Zionist entity. So my point is that there are a number of factors which are going to determine the shape of events to come in the Middle East, especially in this area, and also the responses of the Palestinians. Now, one thing we have seen on the first day of when these Israeli prisoners of war were exchanged, you saw that Hamas was there in full force. Hamas was signaling to the other side that we are there, we are alive, and we are not going away. We are from the soil, and you cannot present us and give Gaza to the Palestinian Authority, the corrupt Palestinian Authority, or think that Gaza can be governed without us, you know. So there are a number of factors that one can see, but there are a number of factors whose interplay into the coming days, weeks, and months, one cannot really predict. Structurally, however, I can say, based on what has happened previously, is that Trump is likely, very likely to continue to essentially repeat the mistake that he made last time. I also say this on the basis of a recent interview, Face the Nation on CBS, I think, by Mike Waltz, his national security advisor, who's a former or maybe serving Green Beret colonel. He talked about this issue, and he talked about Hamas in a way that clearly betrayed woefully inadequate reading of history, and also woefully inadequate assessment of current ground realities. So on that basis, I'm not particularly hopeful. for any kind of decent settlement in the offing. And I think if these illegal settlements are actually supported by the United States, then we should brace ourselves for future rounds of violence, which will keep erupting. And that's going to be the continuing tragedy of Palestinians in this area.
Yes, and thank you for sort of explaining it in such detail, although we don't have enough time for that. And of course, we can keep on talking about it. And from what we've seen in the past few days, escalation in the West Bank, which was already there, not it hadn't ceased. Um, like you're saying, lifting of sanctions against settlers, the land was already being sold to American citizens in the US. It happened last year, if I'm not mistaken, if not in 2023. And now with what I was reading up on the Gazification of Jenin, and PA itself has been inflicting violence on
Oh, yeah.
fighters, residents of Jenin. So yes, it and a lot of young activists and people who were based in the West Bank had been saying this since October 7, that West Bank is the goal. So moving on, because to go to another region, actually come here, because this was about Trump and the US foreign policy. How do you think he's going to approach South Asia? Um, just this is a very broad question, I know. So you can give a broad answer. Yes.
So I don't think that's, structurally the Trump policy is going to be any different from the previous approaches. And once again, there's clear evidence of that change of administrations, despite the difference in style, uh, the change of administrations does not really change some of those policies uh, in the sense that Trump began this whole trade war, or he ratcheted up with China, right? And slapped these tariffs and the rest of it. Then he lost the election. Biden came in. The only difference was that Biden placated the allies. But as far as tariffs were concerned, those tariffs that Trump had slapped on the Chinese exports, Biden did not reverse that policy at all. As a matter of fact, he went further in trying to kneecap the Chinese tech. And you will recall this phrase that was used by Biden administration officials: small yard, high fence strategy, right? Similarly, on oil and gas drilling, much before Biden said, drill, baby, drill, in his inaugural speech recently, and talked about this energy emergency and all of that, the fact is that Biden basically approved more drilling licenses during his tenure than Trump had done before him, right? Although, yes, there is this whole thing about the EV mandate and the rest of it, which Trump has now, obviously, one of his executive orders is that he has removed it. And as he told the Americans, you can buy whichever vehicle you want to buy, whether, regardless of, I mean, he's basically a climate denier. But Biden, although was not ostensibly a climate denier, the fact is that Biden didn't do much for climate, except a tweak here and a tweak there. So basically, on South Asia, in terms of the peer competition with China, in terms of having India as a countervailing force to China, India being part of Quad, Uh, Marco Rubio just had a meeting with the Quad foreign ministers. They put out a statement, also a short one, but without naming China. They've talked about the rules-based order, and they've talked about no unilateral changes in maritime security, and there are so clear references to China and the accusation that China projects power in South and East China Seas. So that's going to be there. I'm not sure how AUKUS will pan out, because the submarines, the nuclear powered submarines, the SSBNs, the Virginia class submarines that the US Navy has to provide to the Aussies, the US Navy itself is short of their requirement on paper. And one of the former Australian prime ministers last year, in an interview, said that Trump is basically going to either pull out of this, because his America first strategy would be, okay, the US Navy doesn't have enough of these, so how can we be providing these to Australia? So that's one way of looking at it. Now, the other thing is that India has been milking all sides. And I am not referring to this as a lamentation, not at all. As a structural realist, I believe that India as a sovereign state, which has a certain policy, has done very well for itself. And so if I were roughly constituted as I am, if I were an Indian analyst, I would say, well, bravo, we're doing so well. That said, Trump is someone who could very likely test India and say, look, if you want us to be in your corner, then you have to prove to me your worth as my ally. Because I have said this before, and I'm going to say this on your program. The Indians are very happy to have that kind of strategic partnership with the United States, that strategic partnership that allows them to develop their missile capability, their space capabilities, and multiple other tech capabilities, and the rest of it. But if anyone in the United States thinks that at the time of crunch, India will actually take on China, then they're living in a fool's paradise. India cannot up and leave. India is contiguous to China. It has a contested border with China. And China is a much stronger adversary. For anyone to think that India is going to fight someone else's battle against China, that's not going to happen. So therefore, if and when something like this happens, Trump is not going to be happy. And my own sense is that Trump is likely to actually say, okay, we're doing X, Y, Z for you. I want to see whether you have done A, B, and C for us, because he's transaction. So that's as far as the US-India relations are concerned. So there is, just to recap my points, there's a broader umbrella thing as a countervailing force to China, and structurally, looking at that strategic partnership. But then there is this, under that umbrella, the thing about Trump saying, what are you doing for me? Right? Just like he does it with everyone. He does it with Germany, with France, with Canada, with Mexico, he's doing that with Denmark. The rest of it, he's going to say, okay, what are you doing for me? As far as us, as in us in Pakistan are concerned, we really don't have much relevance right now. Afghanistan is basically, for now, a story in the past, as many of us uh, feared and also expressed that fear years ago that we'll be left holding the baby. We have been left holding the baby. That said, there are people in the Trump administration, including, by the way, Mike Waltz, who actually never wanted the United States to withdraw from Afghanistan. He talked about an intergenerational war and the rest of it, who believe that there is a rising threat of ISIS and certain other groups. The United Nations is also cognizant of this. Their reports clearly indicate that the Afghan Taliban are providing havens to other terrorist groups, even as they're fighting ISIS, but certainly the TTP and Al Qaeda. And they are aware of the fact that we're fighting against these groups. So some cooperation might be possible. But in terms of overall relations, I don't think the best case scenario would be that they just remain where they are, as in at a very low level, because the chances of their going up are very slim, but the chances of their going down are, far more clear. For instance, in terms of our exports to the United States. If Trump decides to, although yeah, I mean, our exports are low value added, which in this case is kind of fortunate, but you never know. If he says to, placate the lobby there, the textile lobby or the cotton growers or whatever, that I'm going to slap tariffs on Pakistani exports or Bangladeshi exports or exports from certain other countries, then obviously it's going to be tough for us. Which is why we need to diversify, which is why we need to find new markets while retaining ones. In any case, that's an issue which is not in my wheelhouse, frankly. I'm not an economist and certainly not a trade economist. But what I can say is that I would, if our relations remain where they are, frankly, that will be a blessing.
Okay.
Right? So that's as far as South Asia is concerned. And let's see. There are, the Indians are already clamoring about their H-1B1 visas and the fact that, I just saw a couple of clips from these Indian TV channels with a couple of them lamenting the fact that, it takes about 240 days for an appointment at the US Embassy. And so things aren't as rosy between the United States and India as they appear to be. And Trump could very well, as I said, ask them, what am I getting out of this? And
Yes,
that will be an interesting conversation, by the way.
yes. So yeah, on the H-1B visa, we also saw the, different factions of MAGA fighting with each other over this. And, on the foreign workers visa issues and, Indians make up for a big, significant percentage of those visas. Skilled workers in the US, and there was this whole thing online, which was with targeted Indians, far right, America's far right white groups were in a very coordinated way. They came for Indians. So that's there. And I also, it was just news stories that there was in multiple Indian publications and also otherwise that there is that Trump is likely to visit India and China in the early days of his presidency. I think the recent story I saw on that was from January 19th. So that's there. And some concern whether the fact that there is an ease in hostility between India and China after like 4 years, last October, November, October, there was, and they finally reached that point. And the question remains whether the India-China ease in hostility will survive a Trump administration or not. And
Well,
it's kind
that's
of in line with what.
that's a very good point that you've raised. It's actually a very good point because you see, the Indians, if I were an Indian, I
Hmm.
would actually consider a putative Trump visit to Beijing as something very good. You know
Hmm.
why? Because if Trump actually manages to kind of arrest this downward spiral of relations between the US and China, it actually opens up a lot of space, breathing space for India.
Hmm.
Because if this peer competition ramps up, then the US demand that India do more as part of the strategic partnership and as part of Quad against China, that demand will go up. And that is not in favor of India. The kind of this whole idea of being able to milk all sides. If things begin to get to a point where you have to then one of your partners, which is also a superpower, then forces you and say, well, now you got to pay up now. So that is not a good scenario for India. A better, improved Sino-US relations will actually, as I said earlier, will allow India more breathing space and more space to keep milking all sides.
Yeah, yeah. It's also what you said about like Trump being a bully and is him being bullying XYZ, the fact that he's going to like come to India and say, what can you do for me? He's tried to do that with Denmark and other EU countries. I'm also curious whether he'd be able to bully China. I feel like no, China is not to be messed with. But that's a conversation for another day. Ejaz, thank you so much for joining us and speaking about all of the issues that we raised in such detail. This was very interesting. I hope we get to do this again soon, not about on Trump, but like otherwise. And I would like to thank our viewers for watching. Khuda Hafiz.